Chapter 21. They were talking, Eve noticed, when they finally finished supper. They were, just not to each other. Although they sat on the same side of the table, there might as well have been the Gulf of Mexico between them. The one time their hands had touched, the butter knife had actually landed on the floor. "Let's go sit in there," Lisa said when the food was gone. "Jeff will get these dishes later." "Me?" Jeff looked at her, and then he looked back at them solidly. "Yeah, I'll get these later." They weren't overly subtle, Eve thought as she stood, making sure not to look in need of assistance from anyone. In the living room, she chose a seat in the little chair that was neither Jeff's nor Lisa's, nor the intimidating couch where AJ sat. "Here, Eve," Jeff said, handing her Alex. "You look like you haven't been spit up on in a while." Despite the awkwardness of the situation, Eve smiled. "He wouldn't spit up on me, would you, Alex? Would you? No, you wouldn't." Jeff threw a spit-up rag at her, just in case. "Gee, thanks." "So, how's work?" Jeff asked AJ, who readjusted his seat on the couch. "Slow?" "The slower the better," Jeff said. "Very true." "Eve's got news," Lisa said, jumping into the conversation. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Jeff asked. She waited as long as could be considered polite before she got the words out. Then she put the fakest smile she'd ever felt on her face. "I got a promotion." "A promotion? That's great. Congratulations," Jeff said, and Eve saw the same words flash across AJ's face. "I survived a model meltdown," she shrugged. "I guess that's promotion-worthy." "A model meltdown? There can't be that much to melt, can there?" Jeff said, and Lisa reached over and whacked his shoulder with a spit-up rag. He looked at her in surprise. "What?" Eve laughed. "No, the models didn't melt. Well, not really. They got sick, and I had to come up with replacements like 2 minutes before the show went on. It was a nightmare." "Ugh, yeah. Sounds like an absolutely horrible job," Jeff said, acting like he was sympathetic, but Lisa hit him again because he really wasn't. "What? Interviewing models sounds like really grueling work, doesn't it, AJ?" "Better than fighting rush-hour traffic with nothing but a dumb siren to help," AJ agreed. "Well, at least they move out of your way," Lisa said. "It took me 2 hours to get home the other night. 2 hours. I don't know how I'm going to do this when I go back for real." "When are you going back?" Eve asked. 2 weeks, then real life begins. Oh, joy. "I told you we should have stayed in New Mexico," Jeff said, leaning over to Lisa. She smiled and kissed him. "And leave us here with all the work?" AJ asked. "You would." "Yeah, like you didn't think about staying there too," Jeff said, smirking. The smile and all the color drained from AJ's face. He ducked his head and put his hands over the dark blue material of his cap. "They couldn't do without me here." "Yeah," Jeff said, "like you're so important. You decide to show up when the job's already finished." "Hey, now, they didn't tell us somebody was already on that call." "And you were just heartbroken when someone was," Jeff said. "Darn." "Well, I'll tell you, I'd a lot rather show up when they didn't need us than when they really do." I hear you there. I never feel like my head's above board on those calls. It's like just fight to survive and drag as many with you as you can." "Tell me about it. Man, sometimes I'd pay for someone who actually knows what's going on. It's, 'We need you over here. Hey, we need help. Can't you work any faster?' It's chaos sometimes." In all her time with Dustin, Eve had never heard the guys talk so much about the happenings in the field. It was fascinating in a strange kind of way. It was like being let in on a secret society, bent on keeping you out for your own good. "You just wish you could help everybody at the same time, but you never have enough hands," Jeff said. "And the big ones are the worst." "What's the biggest one you've ever worked on?" Eve asked, feeling completely at ease in asking the question. Instantly, Jeff looked at Eve like he had forgotten she was listening, and then over at AJ, who had frozen at the question. For a second, Jeff stumbled, and then he found a plausible disaster to relate. "Well, there was that pile-up that time out on Southwest. You worked that one, didn't you?" "Yeah, I did," AJ said softly, although he never really looked up. "That one was tough." Silence slipped over the room as Eve's gaze went to AJ, and suddenly she was tired of being a spectator with no control. She was tired of being the only one in the room he wouldn't talk to. "How about you, AJ? What was the worst one you ever worked?" A moment slid over the next as he sat without saying a word. "I think I should get those dishes," Jeff finally said as he stood. "Yeah, I'll help," Lisa said, standing. She walked to Eve's chair and held out her hands. "Here, he's got to be ready for a diaper change by now." AJ glanced at his watch and stood. "I really should be getting home." Anger and hurt collapsed on Eve as baby Alex went back to his mother, and she was left holding nothing. It felt like no one wanted her to be a part of the conversation, like her friends would have preferred that she hadn't bothered to even be a part of it in the first place. "What?" she asked as the other three busied themselves away from her. "What did I say?" They didn't answer. In fact, no one was even looking at her. "You can tell me, you know," she said in anger. "I'm not an idiot." In slow succession, Lisa and then Jeff looked at her with dread written all over their faces. "What?" she asked in desperate exasperation. "Tell me, it can't be that bad." It was the instant before the anger reached her feet that AJ turned to her, and eyes full of fear and sadness, his gaze traced over her. "The worst was the night we lost Dustin." The words flitted over her mind without stopping, and her spirit sank on the confusion. "Dustin? But you were there?" Some irrational part of her wanted that answer to be no, although she could tell from every face in the room that it wasn't. AJ's gaze fell to the ground, but he managed one glance up at her. "I was on that call. I was with him on the trip to the hospital." "You?" She fought to make some sense of how that fit everything else, but all it did was blow the whole picture to smithereens. "I don't understand." In the ensuing seconds, it was clear that AJ couldn't get the words strung together to help her understand. "When we brought him out," Jeff finally said from across the room, and her gaze went to him. "The first team there was AJ's, and I was glad because I knew AJ would do everything he could to bring him back." "Bring him?" Air lodged at the top of Eve's throat, going nowhere. "You were there?" she asked AJ again. Almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked as answers to that question that she didn't want to hear fell like bombs in her brain. "I wanted to," he started. "I really did." "But—" Images crashed over her, sending her senses scattering. Finally, her understanding system gave way to her run mechanism. She shook her head to get sanity back, and then she fought to look at Jeff and Lisa. "Thanks for supper. I think I'd better be going." "Eve," Jeff said, reaching out to stop her, but she raised her hands to thwart his effort. "I'll be fine. I'm fine." And with that, she raced out to her car, swathed in darkness down the street. With every step and every movement, she tried to get her brain wrapped around the picture of AJ in the ambulance with Dustin. At the car door, she yanked it open just as AJ raced out of the house after her. "Eve, wait, don't—" But she slammed the door, ignited the engine, and roared away without so much as a backward glance. One part of her said she should be grateful that Dustin was in good hands that night, but another just couldn't get beyond the question of why he had never told her he was there. He was there. Those words stuck like a glitched CD in her mind, playing over and over as hot tears began to fall. The little Civic zoomed under the flashes of amber streetlights, flying to keep up with her. If he could just catch her. What, he asked himself. If he could just catch her, what? How could he make her understand how sorry he was for the whole thing? The only thing running through his mind was catch her, hold her, make sure she's safe. At that moment, the flashing of something other than amber lights swept across his car, and in surprise, he looked up to find a black and white patrol car in his rearview mirror. Oh, great. When Eve made it into her apartment, her head throbbed with the memories. That first phone call, Lisa's panicked, heartrending voice, the long drive to the hospital, knowing the whole way that her world would never be the same. The memories slid through her like water over smooth rocks. Then, slowly, those images were replaced with the funeral, holding herself in check even when what she really wanted was to collapse on the hard church floor and lie there forever, to kick and scream at the world, to ask God to just take her too. All of life in that moment had stopped. The next months were a blur, hardly recognizable even now. Long minutes melting into long hours until one day couldn't be discerned from the next. Then the memories became clear again, and the center of every one was AJ. Right there, so close she could reach out and touch him. But he was a dream, an illusion that she had wanted to see so badly she had convinced herself that he was the one she'd told herself that she didn't want to find. Ache scratched through her at the admissions she'd made to him, talking about Dustin, about losing him, crying in his arms when she should have been running in the other direction as fast as she could go. He wasn't a white knight. He was a predator, waiting to swoop in and sweep her up at her weakest moments. What little logic that was left in her brain protested that line of thought, of course, but the humiliation was too strong. He wasn't the man she thought he was, not even close, and from that point forward, she wanted nothing to do with AJ Knight ever again. By the time AJ pulled into the La Paloma parking lot, he knew his only hope of talking to her would be to actually go knock on her door. That option was out. The headlights of the Civic swept the parking lot and landed squarely on the little silver Celica sitting forlornly in the darkness. He looked at it, trying to decide what to do, but in truth, there was no decision. She was home, and she was safe. That's what he had come to make sure. The words he wanted so badly to say jammed into the brick wall in his head. She didn't need him. Probably she never had. What was it that she said? I'm a big girl. A soft, sad laugh escaped from him at the thought. She was a big girl. She could take care of herself. She certainly didn't need him hanging around like some stupid little lost puppy. With tears raining down over his heart, he turned out of the parking lot and headed home. She was better off without him, although he wondered if he would ever again be whole without her by his side. Chapter 22. By mid-April, life was getting back to whatever had passed for normal before the entrance of AJ in Eve's life. She hadn't seen him since she'd left Jeff and Lisa's. He hadn't called, which she told herself was fine with her. The outward animosity she had felt at being the last to find out the earth-shattering news had dimmed into a dull ache, although she still couldn't quite understand why he hadn't told her. Nonetheless, she had accepted the fact that they simply weren't meant to be together. The 2 times that Lisa had ventured out onto that limb, Eve had cut her off succinctly, and once Lisa had started work again, even that reminder had disappeared. In fact, she hadn't seen or heard from either Jeff or Lisa in more than a month. So, when the phone rang just after 9 o'clock on the 23rd of April, Eve never so much as thought about who would be on the other end. Hello? Hey, Eve girl, Lisa said happily. How goes it? She swallowed everything else. Great. I made it through my first official season change without any major screw-ups, so maybe I'll have a job tomorrow. Lisa laughed. That's good to hear. We've been swamped. I pulled in this new hardware store account a couple weeks ago. It's been nuts. Hardware? I didn't know you knew anything about hardware. Neither did I, but I'm learning fast. Nails, screws, Tool belts? Hot guys? Sounds fun to me. Well, I've yet to see the hot guys part, but I've seen enough nails and screws to last me for a while. I'll bet. How's Alex? Growing. He's almost 13 pounds already. You lay him on the floor and he'll hold his head up like those dumb bobbing dog heads in the back of a car. The reference, which should have been funny, only sucked the air right out of Eve. I bet he's a doll. He is. I wouldn't trade him for anything. Alone, coiled around Eve as she thought about Lisa's life, Lisa didn't come home to an empty house that sounded like a mausoleum every night. No, she had family, people to count on her. Tiredly, Eve laid her head back in the chair. How's Jeff? As insane as usual, he decided to hang a ceiling fan in our bedroom. About blew himself up in the process. Is he all right? Yeah, he'll live, although he does still buzz from time to time. In the background, Eve heard his voice. I heard that. You were supposed to, Lisa sang out, and Eve smiled. So, we were wondering, Lisa said, coming back on the line. What are you doing this Sunday? This Sunday? Why? Gabe and Ash invited us out to Astroworld. She got a discount on some tickets or something. Uh-oh, Eve said, smelling a setup. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain person trying to rope me into seeing another certain person, now would it? Silence, and Eve knew. Well, actually, Jeff did ask AJ, and I think he's coming, but... Concern raced through Eve at the tone in Lisa's voice. But what? Lisa sighed slowly. He's bringing a date. Oh, it was the only thing Eve could think of to say as her mind spun on the words. So, if you want to bring somebody too, that's cool, Lisa said quickly. Oh, I don't know. Come on, Eve, Lisa said, and there was genuine pleading in her voice. I never get to see you anymore, and Astroworld's a big place. We probably won't even see that much of them. Still, the thought of being there with him, being with someone else, tore through her like wildfire. Please, Eve, you don't even have to ride any rides if you don't want to. Huge parts of her wanted to say yes, but the mere thought of seeing him with someone else kept her from the word. You know, Lise, I think I'm going to have to take a rain check on this one. Oh, Eve, come on. I wouldn't have told you if I thought you were going to bail on me. Please, I'm asking you. I'm begging you. The ache tracing through her was sniffed away with one breath. I really don't think it's a good idea. But this isn't about him. This is about me, your friend, asking you to come and spend a fun afternoon with me. We can eat cotton candy and funnel cakes and caramel apples. I hate caramel apples. Then we'll get you the candied kind. Come on, Eve. It'll be fun. Although it sounded anything but fun, Eve sighed. She really did want to see her friends again, and she was getting sick of looking at the apartment walls. I'll tell you what. If I can find a date, I'll come. Yay! Lisa shrieked. Then I'll call you tomorrow night. If you haven't found one, I'll find you one. Oh, great. There's a scary thought. Seriously, it'll be fun, so don't flake out on me here. Bribe somebody, blackmail them, hog-tie them if you have to. But come, okay? Despite the doom in her chest, Eve laughed. I'll try. As they drove to Astroworld in the little Civic, AJ looked over at Melody and smiled. She was truly a good friend. For the last 2 months, she had been unwavering in her quest to help him get over Demon Woman, her choice term for Eve. At first, he had tried to tell her that Eve wasn't so bad, but Melody insisted that anybody who could make AJ look so sad deserved the title. In his heart, he knew that it was he who deserved the term, but convincing Melody of that was hopeless. So he had finally given up. Man, it's been so long since I've been out here, Melody said. I think the last time was just after we graduated. Geez, that's been a long time. You feeling a little old over there?" he asked teasingly. "Old?" she asked, wrinkling her face at the word. "Don't ever use that word around me. My mom is old. I'm just getting started." Granted, we don't know what on. Hey, speak for yourself. I'll have you know I'm starting management classes in the fall. Instantly, the bravado fell from his face. Management? You? Yes, me. I talked to Farron the other day, and she thinks I'd be perfect to take over for her when she moves on in a couple of years. But to do that, I have to have a degree, so I'm going to go back to school. Soft incredulousness flowed through him as he looked at her. That's cool, Mel. It really is. I think you'll be great at it. Yeah, she said, crossing her arms. I do too. She sat for a moment and then glanced over at him. So, what about you? You planning on doing the search and rescue thing forever? He shrugged. I haven't found anything I like any better yet, so... Slowly, she shook her blonde locks. Look at us, a couple of slackers who've actually made something out of ourselves. Pretty unbelievable, I'd say. Yep, pretty unbelievable. Although she hadn't had to hog-tie him, Eve was glad when Blaine, the new guy in menswear, had said yes to her request with no more than a few moments of decision. Granted, she'd never seen him in anything other than a suit and tie, but the long khaki shorts and tank t-shirt weren't half bad. His dark hair and surfer boy looks weren't half bad either, although he really could have ditched the "aren't you so lucky to be seen with me" attitude. She couldn't count the number of times he'd run his fingers through his hair to feather it back, and by the time they got to the park, he had looked in the rearview mirror more than he had at the road. The sunglasses he donned when they got out to the car didn't help, but he had come on ultra-short notice, so she wasn't going to complain. Besides, what had Lisa said about not even seeing each other all that much once they were at the park? They said to meet them by the gate, Eve said as she readjusted the waistband of her white shorts, pulled smartly over the navy and white swimsuit top. The braid running from the top of her head down past her shoulders swung over her shoulder as she adjusted her own sunglasses. She looked at her watch. We'd better hurry or they might leave us. Blaine swiped a hand through his hair and reached for her hand. Hate to keep them waiting. You guys go on in, Jeff said as the six of them stood at the gate. We can wait for Eve. Yeah, it's silly for us all to stand out here, Lisa said, shifting nervously. She hadn't looked comfortable since the moment AJ had walked up with Melody at his side, and the longer they stood, the more distressed she looked. Well, I say we go on in, Gabe said. We could at least get in line for something before it gets terribly crowded. I'm sure she'll be here any... Oh, hey, speak of the devil, Gabe said as his gaze swept the parking lot beyond. When AJ turned, his heart hit the bottoms of his shoes. Of course she was gorgeous. That was a given. But the sight of her hand tucked firmly in RoboCop's made jealousy leap to his fists. Hey, Lisa said, stepping over and giving her friend a hug. You made it. We're here, Eve said, returning the hug. Lisa stepped back and surveyed the medium-tall, well-built guy standing next to Eve. And who's your friend? This is Blaine Donovan. Blaine, this is everybody. Hi, everybody, Blaine said in a mid-baritone pitch. The others returned the greeting. I don't want to be rude, Gabe said, jumping in, but could we do the introductions in line? They laughed and followed Gabe and Ashley into the short line to the gate. Eve was having a hard time finding a place to look that didn't include the lithe but rock-solid frame she had felt only in her dreams for nearly 2 months. His face hadn't changed, although the lightheartedness that had lit his golden eyes seemed to have dimmed since their last meeting. Without much watching, she could see that her hopes for his date to be someone he'd just met and asked out were less than real. No, he stayed close to her, his hand on her back guiding her forward. Always aware and concerned for her comfort and safety. Always the gentleman, even at a lowly amusement park. Still, something in the back of Eve's mind said she had seen her before. Somewhere. I say we hit the serial thriller first, Gabe said from the front. "The longer we wait, the worse that line's going to be." "Oh boy, count me out," Lisa said. "I don't do roller coasters." "Don't do roller coasters?" Gabe asked, and then he looked at Jeff. "Why'd you bring her along anyway?" "To drive home," Jeff said with a shrug, and Lisa hit him upside the head. He ducked away warily. "It was a joke." "Not a very good one," she said. "I've heard Batman the Escape is awesome," Blaine said from behind Eve, and she jumped at the sound of his voice. "Yeah, I want to hit that one too, but I think that's like way at the other end of the park," Gabe said. He grabbed a map from a receptacle and opened it. "Yep, it is. I say we start here and work our way around." "Sounds good to me," Jeff said. "How about you guys?" AJ looked at his date, who nodded enthusiastically. "Sounds good to us," he said. Even the sound of his voice hurt. Eve put her head down and did her best to disappear. He was happy. She was miserable. Yes, life was definitely back to normal. From his place in line beside Melody, AJ watched Eve sitting with Lisa and Ashley on the bench beside the serial thriller. His spirit hurt to look at her, and yet his gaze wouldn't tear itself away. All he wanted to do was go over there, put his arms around her, and have everything be back the way it was on the mountain. In exasperation, he sighed and looked back at the coaster he was about to get on with Melody. Then, carefully, she leaned into him. "You know, a smile wouldn't kill you." Despite the ache in his heart, he smiled. "I thought your only specialty was video games." "Oh, you'd be surprised," Melody said, and he felt the soft touch of her hand on his back. She was a good friend, and he was glad he'd asked her to come. He would never have gotten through today without her. The previous coaster rolled to a stop, and they all stepped forward to get on. As she watched the coaster loop through a series of inversions, Eve's heart went with it. She had seen the private exchange they had shared, and it did more to solidify his place with his date than anything previous. "Melody seems nice," Ashley said from beside Lisa. "She's just AJ's style." Eve felt the silent conversation pass behind her back as a sad acceptance washed over her. Melody. Of course, that's where she had seen her before. "Yeah," Eve said softly when no one said anything else. "I guess they were more than friends after all." When she turned with a tight smile, the other two women were looking at her with sympathy in their eyes. "Well, there's nothing wrong with Blaine," Ashley said, trying to cover her gaffe. Reluctantly, Eve's gaze traveled back to the coaster. No, nothing was wrong with Blaine, except for the fact that he wasn't AJ. "I say we do the dungeon drop next," Gabe said excitedly, as they sat around the table eating lunch. "That thing that drops you off the tower?" Jeff asked, as if it would drop you right into hell. "Yeah, that looks mind-blowing," Gabe said. "A little too mind-blowing for me," Jeff said, chewing on a fry. "I don't do heights." "Is that why your knuckles are permanently white?" Gabe asked. "Coasters I can handle. Dropping out of the sky? I don't think so." "You should see this guy," Gabe said, not giving up as he clutched the table in front of him. "I don't think he ever let go of the bar once today." "I did once," Jeff said. "Yeah, right. That first time when we took off." Gabe held up his hands and then jerked forward and grabbed for the table. "Dungeon drop sounds like fun," Eve said, having gotten her fill of watching the others have fun without her. The shops that Ashley and Lisa went into held no fascination for her. All they had was overpriced junk as far as she was concerned. For most of the morning, she had chosen to tag along, waiting just long enough to not get on the ride before Lisa and Ashley found a store to go into. Then Eve was forced to sit and watch as the others twisted and turned their way to utter bliss. As she sat listening to them regale each pitch and turn, she made up her mind that she'd had enough of sitting on benches. So, when Jeff looked at her like she had two heads, she shrugged. What? How bad could it be? "You're mighty brave all of a sudden," You wouldn't even ride the Serpent, Jeff said, referring to the not-quite-kids coaster that Jeff had almost talked even Lisa onto. Eve smiled. You make the decision, the courage will come. She felt AJ's glance go over her, and she leaned closer to Blaine. Besides, we've been here 5 hours, and I've only spent 10 minutes with my date. Truthfully, she didn't want to spend much more than another minute with him, but the fact that Melody and AJ were practically inseparable hadn't escaped her notice. Cool, Gabe said happily. No more odd man out. As they stood in line under the tower, AJ watched her even though that was the last place he wanted to be looking. Her and Blaine. Well-built, tan, good-looking Blaine. He was a jerk. That much AJ could tell from halfway across the park. What he couldn't figure out was why she couldn't figure that out. Finally, out of sheer desperation, he decided that focusing on her, fantasizing about what could have been, or should have been, was stupid. It was over, and it was clearly time to move on. You know, this thing only holds 4 at a time, AJ said to no one in particular. What, are we going to draw straws for who goes it alone? Oh, no you don't, Melody said, clutching AJ's elbow. I've got me a partner. Me too, Eve said, grabbing onto Blaine. AJ looked at Gabe with a smirk. Sorry, big guy, you just drew the short straw. You would do that to me? Gabe asked incredulously. You would leave me to drop out of the sky all by myself? Yes, we would, AJ said, and the others laughed as the cage returned to a standing position. The other occupants stepped out, woozy from the ride, but laughing hysterically. He turned to Blaine and Eve and smiled as he swept a hand in front of him. You guys first, and he followed Melody onto the ride. Eve chose a middle seat and strapped herself in. I want it outside, Melody said petulantly when it became clear that her seat was next to Eve. It's yours, AJ said, instantly relinquishing his seat to her. However, when he realized who he would be sitting by, he hesitated for a moment. Then resolution slipped over his face. Is this seat taken? It's all yours, Eve said with a tight smile. When he sat down next to her, Eve had to remember to breathe. That tanned, solid arm brushed across hers, and she lost track of her anger at him and the space she was supposed to be occupying in the universe. The cage jerked to life, and she squealed in surprise. Don't worry, Melody said, leaning over so she could see Eve. If we crash, it'll happen so fast you won't even feel it. Oh, that's comforting, Eve said back. Just trying to help. It isn't working very well. This is nothing, Melody said as the ground disappeared from beneath Eve's feet. You should have been on the serial thriller. I thought I was going to fly right out of that thing. Sounds like fun, Eve said. Hey, look, there's Jeff and Lisa, AJ said, spotting them on the asphalt now far below. He waved, and they waved back. The air that had escaped from her vanished completely the higher they went. She was up here, but she couldn't remember why anymore. Is it too late to say I don't want to do this? She asked. I think you made that choice on the ground, AJ said, looking at her, and when her gaze caught his, the smile in his eyes was genuine. He winked at her. You made the decision. Courage can't be far away. Yeah, as long as I don't pass out before we get there. The cage chose that moment to hit the stop at the top of the tower, and Eve let out another shriek. She squeezed her eyes closed, willing time and space to stop right there. I can't do this. Sure you can, AJ said softly. The cage hit the other side of the slide and stopped. It was at that moment that she felt his hand gently touch the one of hers closest to his, clutching to the bar for dear life. With no other thought, she grabbed his hand just as the bottom dropped out from under her life. She screamed, she was sure, but in reality there was only the feeling of flying with only his hand to hold onto. Together they plunged to earth in one heart-stopping drop. And then she was back down, although she couldn't quite be sure they hadn't just fallen into some parallel universe. A moment at the bottom just before the cage sat upright, and then his hand was gone. "That was fun," Melody said. "Yeah, fun," Eve said shakily. When the cage came to a stop, she stood and nearly lost her balance getting down. Instantly, 2 sets of hands from either side of her reached out to catch her. "You okay?" Blaine asked, and when she looked at him, fog was all she saw. "Yeah, fine." She retrieved her balance and followed the others out. "How was it?" Gabe yelled at them from his position in the cage going up. "Awesome," AJ yelled back, and Eve couldn't disagree. "I want to do the wagon wheel," Melody said when Gabe joined them to try to decide where to go next. "We missed that one." "I'm going to do this one again," Gabe said, pointing at the dungeon drop. "You want to join me, Eve?" She backed away from him quickly. "Oh, I don't think so. I'm thinking the wagon wheel sounds much safer." "I'm with Eve." Jeff draped an arm around her shoulders. Gabe looked at his watch. "Tell you what, why don't we split up for a while? We can meet back here in an hour or so." "What about Lisa and Ash?" Jeff asked. "I'll see if I can find them when I get back down." "Cool," Jeff said. "Lead the way, Mel." As they walked through the park, Eve noticed how Melody stuck close to AJ, but she also noticed how he managed to put some distance between them. For her part, she put as much space between her and Blaine as she could. She didn't know if he had seen the circumstances on the dungeon drop, but she wasn't taking any chances. "Oh, AJ, remember the last time we went on Thunder River?" Melody asked, falling into him laughing as she pointed to the sign pointing to the attached water park. "Oh, don't," AJ said, closing his eyes. "No, you've got to hear this one," Melody said to the others. "We get on this ride, right? And we get drenched. Like, what would you expect on Thunder River? But Genius here had worn these white shorts that when they got wet, they became, like, see-through." "I didn't know they were going to be that bad," he protested. "He was like a walking Calvin Klein ad for an hour," Melody said. "You should have seen some of the looks he got." AJ nodded and smirked at her. "Thank you so much for telling that story." "Well, you set yourself up so nicely sometimes, like that knee-boarding incident." They reached the wagon wheel and got in line. "Now that one wasn't my fault," AJ said. "It's never your fault," Melody said, not slowing down. "Okay, we went out to the lake, and AJ's going to try this knee-boarding thing because he's crazy or something. So he straps this board to his knees, and they take off, and everything's fine. He's all doing all these tricks and stuff, showing off as usual. Then the guy in the boat decides to see if AJ can do this jump. They're flying across the water. Then, just before they get there, here comes this jet ski guy, and he was like yelling, 'Ah!' all out of control and everything. They were fixing to clothesline the poor guy with a rope, so AJ lets go of the rope on the outside of the turn, and poof, he hits the jump ramp head on. Laid him out cold." Jeff cracked up as concern traced just under Eve's own laugh. "Why didn't you go around it?" Jeff asked. "Around it? I didn't even see the thing until it was right there." AJ laid his head back and flung out his hands as he closed his eyes. "Man, I was gone." "It took 25 stitches to sew up the side of your head," Melody said. "AJ doesn't kneeboard anymore." "I can imagine," Jeff said. 25 stitches? Did you go into the paramedic thing after that?" "No, actually, I went to LA, AJ said without a trace of humor, but the others laughed even harder. "That makes perfect sense," Jeff said, fighting to sound serious. "Oh, hey, tell them about your pink hair," Melody said as the line moved forward. "Ugh," AJ said, shaking his head at that thought. "I'd tried out for this punk band out in LA, but they wouldn't even consider you if you didn't get all wild and stuff. So I dyed my hair pink, put spikes in it, and wore all these dog chains and stuff. It was awful." "Did you get the job?" Jeff asked as he leaned on the railing. "No," AJ said in exasperation. So then I had to go dye my hair back, only it didn't exactly work like I thought it was going to." "He looked like a skunk in drag," Melody said. "I have a picture to prove it." "I thought you burned that thing," AJ said. "No, I told you I burned it," she said, laughing. "You can never have too much blackmail." "Oh, great." "So, Melody," Eve asked, thinking back to the most embarrassing story he'd told her, "did you ever go skiing with AJ?" His gaze jumped to Eve, and his eyes said he knew exactly where she was going with that question. "No, I've never had that pleasure," Melody said, and the teasing tone had left her voice. "Too bad," Eve said, smirking at him. "I hear he's a wild man on the mountain." "Oh, look," AJ said quickly. "Our ride's here." "Oh, look, that was smooth, Knight," Jeff said, reaching out and collaring AJ. "You just don't want to tell any more stories." "You got that right," AJ said. The attendant opened the gate, and laughing, they crossed into a dim brown carpeted circle. Eve stood by Blaine, and Jeff, Melody, and AJ went to the other side. AJ looked at her and smiled, and she returned it with no thought that she shouldn't. She shook her head at him, and he winked. Then the door closed, and slowly the chamber began rotating. Slowly at first. Then faster and faster they went until she couldn't even see anymore. Her body was plastered to the carpeting at her back. The thing tipped up one way, then the other. Then the floor beneath her slid a full 6 inches away from her feet. When it slowed and finally stopped, Eve laughed at the dazed look on the 3 faces across from them. Jeff took a small step away from the wall and stumbled slightly as they met at the exit. "I'm thinking I should have stayed with Gabe," he said. "The Texas tornado," Blaine said, pointing up at the giant structure beyond when they exited. "Let's do that one again." He grabbed Eve's hand, and before she really got her footing back, they were leading the way. "We should come in April all the time," AJ said as they climbed the ramp to the entrance. "There's nobody out here today." "Yeah, but those clouds might have something to do with that," Jeff said, indicating the bank of dark gray clouds that had overtaken the sky. "Wimps," AJ said. They moved up in line. "I say we hit greased lightning again as soon as we get off here." Eve's head was already spinning, but she wasn't backing down now. It wasn't long, and they were led onto the ride. Melody and AJ took the car ahead of Eve and Blaine, and just before it took off, AJ looked back at Jeff, who was behind Eve. "Hands up." "They are as up as they're going to get," Jeff said, and Eve laughed as the ride chugged forward. She closed her eyes, praying this would actually be fun. Oh boy. By the time they got off of the Texas tornado, AJ was having the time of his life. True, he wasn't with her, but he was closer to her than he had been in more than a month, and besides the fact that Melody seemed not quite herself, everything was wonderful. "So, Melody," Eve said when they were standing in line for greased lightning, "you're the one who works at Galaxy Shoes, right?" "Yeah," Melody said in surprise. 2 years now." "Man, I've got to get back out there," Eve said. "I got this dress. It's like periwinkle, and I can't find anything to go with it." "Have you tried white?" Melody asked as the guys quietly bowed out of the conversation and into their own. "Yeah, but then all you see is the shoes. I tried black too, but that wasn't right either. I've been looking everywhere, but nothing matches it." "Periwinkle. That can be tough. Either it's too blue or too purple." Melody shook her head slowly. "I can't think of anything we have right off. You know, I did see one in the buyer's catalog the other day that I thought was really creative. It was tan straps, but the back of it was like solid, and it had all these cool color beads on it." "Oh, you do the buying then?" Eve asked. Melody shrugged. "Not yet, but I'm thinking about going back to school to get my degree." "Really? That's awesome. What are you majoring in?" "Probably management, but I haven't really decided yet." "Be sure to take some textile classes if you can. They'll really give you a leg up when you get out." The line moved forward. "I just hope I'm not getting into something I can't finish," Melody said, admitting that sheepishly. Take the first step, Eve said. One step at a time. You'll be amazed at what you can do. I thought I was toast when I first started. I wasn't exactly the best student in high school, but I made it. So don't let them psych you out. If you want to bad enough, you'll do fine. Gratefully, Melody smiled at her, and together they stepped up to the gate. Eve arched her back and looked up at the metal monster looming before her. "Aw, man, I can't believe I'm doing this." "Thrills aren't your style?" "Once it's over, it's fun. Until then," Eve made a face at her. "Well, then just don't look until it's over." Eve laughed. "That's easy for you to say." "What?" AJ asked from behind Melody, and she looked back and shook her head. "Girl talk," she said. "You wouldn't understand." "We were talking about shoes," Eve said teasingly, and AJ's face fell. You're right. I wouldn't understand." Eve looked at Melody and shook her head. Men. They're hopeless. "Is my head still attached?" Eve asked Melody when they descended the exit ramp after the 360 loop. With both hands, Eve reached up and readjusted her skull on her neck. "I think it fell off on that backward loop thing." "How could you tell?" AJ asked teasingly. "Air doesn't weigh enough to notice." "Oh, funny," Eve said, sneering at him. "Your date is so hilarious, Mel. Wherever did you find him?" "I wish I knew. I'd send him back." "Hey," AJ said, trying to sound hurt. "Don't hey me, mister," Melody said. "I really don't think it's too funny when my riding partner is trying to figure out how the bar thing works just before we take off." "I was just asking," he said. "Well, next time, keep your curiosity to yourself." "That's hard for him to do," Eve said. "He is a guy, remember?" "Oh, yeah, I forgot," Melody said dramatically. "Okay, that could be taken a couple of ways, and I don't like either of them," AJ said. "Poor baby," Melody said, running her hand over his backward blue cap. "He's so mistreated." Eve shook her head. "Hardly. He deserves everything he gets." "Oh, yeah?" AJ asked, jabbing her in the ribs. "Say that again. I dare you." She tried to get away from him, but he was persistent as he started tickling her harder. "AJ deserves—" She beat his hands back, but he wasn't about to quit. "Everything— Mercy, mercy!" She hit at his hands, pushing him away. "Hey, I said mercy!" He let her go. "You're supposed to let go when somebody says mercy," she said, reaching over and poking him in the ribs. "Don't you know anything?" "Oh, sorry, I must have missed that one." "Yeah, that one and 57 others." She jabbed him twice more for good measure. "Aren't you going to do something about her?" AJ asked Melody, who shrugged. "Why? She's telling the truth." "Ah," AJ said unhappily. "You'll learn," Jeff said. "I'll learn what?" AJ asked. "Never take them on more than one at a time, or you're done for." "You tell me this now." "Hey, you got yourself into this mess. Good luck." Jeff glanced down the park. "There's Gabe." They strode up, and their party was once again complete. "Well, you guys don't look too sick," Gabe said, appraising them. "Sick? Us?" Jeff asked as he swayed forward woozily. "Never." A clap of thunder sounded above them, and Gabe looked up. "If we're going to get on the cyclone, we'd better get going." "Forward," Jeff said like a knight with his sword leading an army. Together, they made their way through the park. Just before they got to the ride, Melody broke away from them. "I've got to go visit the little girl's room right quick." "Now?" AJ asked. "Trust me, now's a good time," she said. "Go on, I'll catch up." When she veered off, AJ stood in confusion for a moment. "Come on, Age. We'll just be right over here," Gabe said. He looked over at Lisa and Ashley, who were following them. "Y'all can even sit on the bench over there and wait for her." "Oh, Ash, I see funnel cakes," Lisa said, steering Ashley away from the group. "I guess it's just us then," Gabe said. "I think I'm going to sit this one out too," Blaine said. "That wagon wheel messed up my head." "Chicken?" Jeff said teasingly. It's called knowing when to take a break, Blaine said as another clap cracked above them. He waved quickly. Have fun. And so Eve found herself with 3 guys walking up the steps to the Texas Cyclone, wondering how she had gotten here and why she hadn't had the presence of mind to stay on the ground with Blaine. Truthfully, she'd much rather be up here than down there, except for the little detail of the wood and metal-framed roller coaster twisting above her. I've got $10 that says you won't let go of the bar on that last big hill, Gabe said to Jeff. I raise you 10 and bet that I won't either. You are a disgrace to firemen everywhere, Gabe said, shaking his head. Afraid of heights? How did you ever make it through the academy? Willpower, Jeff said. Lots and lots of willpower. The attendant unchained the gate and backed up. We get the back, AJ called, grabbing Eve's hand and pulling her down the walkway. We get the front, Gabe said, turning the other direction and pulling Jeff with him. When they got to the car, AJ stepped in and slid down into the seat. Carefully, Eve slid in beside him as she pushed a stray piece of hair behind her ear. Riders filled the cars between them. She exhaled slowly to pull her scattered nerves back to her as AJ rubbed his hands together excitedly. This is great. Yeah, she said, barely breathing. Then the hydraulics let the bar down in front of them, and even if she had wanted to, she couldn't get away. Here we go, AJ said, smiling at her. Oh boy. Chapter 23. Eve's knuckles went white before they were barely around the first turn. She was hanging on, not because of the ride, but so she wouldn't collide with him as the coaster sent her into his seat. He could tell, because not only was she holding on, but she kept fighting to slide back into her own seat. The first 2 head-jerking turns were behind them when it hit him how furiously she was holding on. He knew why. He knew, and yet suddenly he didn't want her to ever be afraid to trust herself with him again. He didn't want her to hang on to life, trying not to touch him, to not get into his space every time they happened to be together. No, even if they could only be friends from here on out, he wanted her to be able to trust him. He wanted her to know that she could lean on him no matter what. And so around the 3rd turn, he reached over and pried her hand off the bar. Hands up, he said teasingly. No, she screamed as her body collided with his, and he laughed as he laid one arm around her. I won't break, he yelled to her. A moment of indecision, and slowly her other hand let go just as the ride slung him her way. Well, I might, she said, although there was a smile just beneath the statement. Sorry, he yelled, fighting his way back to his seat. No, you're not. Yes, I am. Here, let me show you. His arm came around her shoulders again, and then, finally, she stopped fighting and let herself fold into his arms. He looked at her, and as they flew around the next corner as one, his heart could lie no longer. See, no breaking. When she looked at him, her eyes held questions he finally felt strong enough to answer. In the next second, he felt the first raindrops splatter across his arms. His gaze went to the gray heavens above them, where his face met up with 100,000 of their comrades dropping from the sky. Ah! Eve screamed, pulling her arms over her head for protection, but the downpour had other intentions. Less than seconds later, what restraint the storm had exerted at its commencement vanished into sheets and sheets of bone-chilling water. The coaster rounded the last turn and began its slow climb up the last hill as the riders on board screamed, not because of the ride, but because they were getting drenched. Oh, it's cold, Eve said, shrinking toward AJ to get away from it. There was no real decision as both arms dropped around her in protection from the chilly water. His body huddled over hers in a vain attempt to shield her until they could get back down under cover. At the top of the hill, however, the coaster, which was barely moving at all, angled across the top crest, dropped the first car off, and then jerked to a heart-wrenching stop. Instantly, AJ looked around in confusion. They should be at the bottom by now. Instead, he and Eve were lying nearly backward, looking up at a sky that was dropping buckets of cold, crystal droplets on them. "What happened?" Eve asked, unburying herself from his embrace long enough to glance around. "Why'd we stop?" "I don't know." AJ moved only enough to try to see the cause, but he could see nothing other than gray rain. "Why aren't we going?" "I don't know," he said again, as confused as she was, but struggling to find a rational explanation. "The rain, I guess. They must be afraid the brakes won't work." She glanced over the edge. "But we can't stay up here." He followed her gaze and sheepishly smiled. "Well, unless you're going to climb down, I don't see how you have much of a choice." Her gaze went to the sky as the rain slid off her face. "You mean we're stuck up here?" "I'd say that's a pretty good deduction." Despite the circumstances, he really couldn't complain when he looked at her. "Good thing you wore your swimsuit." She looked at him incredulously. "Yeah, good thing you didn't wear those white shorts." Laughter broke through his concern. "No kidding." Slowly, she spun forward in her seat, pushed her feet up higher on the car footboard, and leaned her head back into the deluge. "This is just my luck." His gaze traced over her, and all the rationalizations that he had worked so hard to come up with disappeared into the streams flowing down her face. "Why?" Barely perceptively, she shook her head. "Look at me. I'm stuck on a roller coaster in the rain with somebody who'd rather jump off a bridge than talk to me." Confusion traced over him. "I want to talk to you." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she let her head lean to the side to look at him. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to lie about it anymore. I mean, I said I didn't want the whole commitment thing, and then I did a 180 on you without warning." Concern slid through his heart. "That wasn't you, that was me. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. I should have told you about Dustin, about that night." Her eyes were laced with liquid that didn't come from the sky when her gaze slipped over him. "You know, it's not that I don't believe you did everything you could, because I know you did. I know you would have moved heaven and earth to bring him back, even if you didn't know him or me at the time. I know that because that's how you are. But I just keep thinking about how much time you had to tell me, how many chances you had, but you never said anything." "I didn't know how," he said as guilt slipped into his voice. He wanted to reach out to her, take her in his arms, and somehow go back and start over, but he was here, and here was all he had. "I knew I should tell you, but I just kept thinking about all the things I could have done that night that I didn't do, and all the things I did that I shouldn't have. I felt responsible, Eve, like I was the reason you were in so much pain. I mean, I know Dustin meant everything to you, that he was the only guy you could ever love like that. And I understand that, I really do." His gaze found the shadows at their feet. "I just kept thinking if he was still here, if Dustin was still alive, you would never have even looked at me." His hand went up to his hat and ran itself over it. "Then I'd think how completely horrible that sounded, and it was like if I just didn't tell you, if you just didn't know, somehow I wouldn't have to feel so guilty for loving you." Her gaze jumped to his face, and he tried to look at her, even as he tried not to let the tears burning in his head fall. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "That's lousy now, I know, but you've got to believe it. I loved everything about being with you, the popcorn and the painting, and just the way I felt when I was around you. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to lose you." He shrugged slightly. "I guess that worked, huh?" Quickly he ran a hand over his face. His gaze dropped to his hands. "I just thought you should know that." The splattering of the raindrops was the only sound between them for several long moments as guilt, love, and heartbreak tore through him. He couldn't look at her, so he gazed down through the wood and metal bars beneath them. Jumping through that jumble looked far less painful than life at that moment. "You know, there were things that I thought I understood," she said slowly. "Things I thought I had figured out. Like if love was strong enough, it could last forever, and that forever actually meant forever. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes forever means right now. And if you squander right now, all the rest of forever means nothing. I think about all those moments that I could have had with Dustin, the ones that we would have had if he had lived, but those don't compare to the ones when I had a chance to be with him, and I didn't because I thought we had a tomorrow. Sometimes tomorrow isn't real. Sometimes if you don't grab on and hold on to today, all you have is memories of memories that never happened because you were too busy living for tomorrow. I won't lie to you. Dustin was a big part of my life, and he'll be part of me forever, but that doesn't give me the right to use him to push my life away now. If I sit here and let my past keep me from my present, then I've made the same stupid mistake I made with Dustin." It was then that he felt her hand on his shoulder as the splatter slowed. His gaze went to hers. "I can't promise you forever," she said, fighting through the tears. "I can't even promise you tomorrow. But I can promise right now, if you're interested." "If I'm..." "Because the truth is, I love you, AJ Knight. Right here and right now, I love you." With a crack, his heart burst open. His gaze buried deep into hers. "I'm so sorry." As the raindrops ebbed from between them, she shook her head. "No, that's the past. Let it go. I have. Besides, I just said I love you, and I want to know what you have to say about that right now." He smiled. "You have to ask?" Then his smile fell as gently he laid his hands on her shoulders. His gaze slipped through her eyes into her soul. "I love you, Eve, and I want to spend every right now I have left with you." Love, hope, and joy flooded over him as he slowly leaned toward her. When his lips found hers, he knew there had never been anything more perfect in all of his life. As his hold on her tightened, suddenly the coaster chugged upward, jerking so unexpectedly that their noses crashed together. "Ow!" she said, backing away from him and laughing as she put her hand to her nose. One rung at a time, they approached the crest. He laughed with an apology twined in it. "I kiss you and you say ow?" "Yeah, talk about hands up," she said, wickedness lacing her words. Slowly her arm dropped around his shoulders as her other hand wound over his hand that rested on the bar. He caught her intent just before she made it to his lips, and just as they crested the top, she removed the last link of the chain between them. Their lips met again in perfect time with the screams of their fellow riders. Dropping out of the sky had never been so thrilling, and by the time the coaster braked and slowed into the station, his head was whirling like it never had before. When she backed up to look at him, there was a smirk of satisfaction on her face. "So, how was that?" she asked, as though there wasn't a single other person for miles. "Awesome," he breathed, falling through her eyes. The coaster jerked to a stop, and the bar went up, but neither of them moved. "I love you," he said, barely getting the words through the feelings jamming his chest. "I love you too," she said, and he could see no hesitation anywhere in her. "Hey, you two," Gabe called from the platform. "Haven't you spent enough time in that car?" Eve winked at AJ with a look that his heart knew said, "Not nearly long enough." Then, quickly, she rejoined reality and turned to get out onto the platform. Gabe offered her a hand up, and she climbed out. AJ wanted all of reality to just go away and leave them alone. However, that not being a logical option, he swung himself up and out of the car, only to find her waiting for him. There was no hesitation as she wrapped an arm under his, and everything in him wished they never had to let go. However, he saw the skeptical look that Jeff shot at him as they headed for the exit, and he knew that their right now on top hadn't followed them to the bottom. "Okay, mister." Gabe punched Jeff in the chest, which caught Jeff totally off guard, as he was busy watching AJ and Eve. "You owe me money. Pay up." "Money? How do you figure?" Jeff asked, never quite making the leap from AJ and Eve to Gabe's statement as they descended the exit ramp. "Yep, $20. You said you weren't going to let go at the top, and you did." "No, I said I wouldn't let go." "Oh." "Yeah, oh, you owe me $20. Now, pay up." Even as he laughed, AJ saw Lisa and Ashley standing under an awning across the walkway, although the deluge had all but dissipated. Like it or not, being together with Eve would have to wait. He pulled his arm from her shoulders reluctantly and stuck his hand in his pocket. He wanted to hold her, to tell the world that he loved her, but what he simply couldn't do was to hurt Melody. And he was sure coming off a ride like a love-struck teenager with a woman Melody despised wasn't the best way to accomplish that, especially when she had been waiting for him at the bottom for more than 20 minutes. However, Eve's fingers never untangled themselves from his belt loop, and his heart loved that feeling too much to explain why she should let him go. "That's not fair," Jeff said. "You changed the rules." "I didn't change the rules. It was an act of God," Gabe said seriously. "I guess he wanted me to have that money more than he wanted you to." "Nice try," Jeff said as they walked up to the other two women. "Lisa, tell your husband he should honor his debts," Gabe said. Jeff put an arm around Lisa, and she squirmed away from him because he was soaked. "Don't you know by now he doesn't listen to a word I say? We're married, remember?" "Ah, geez," Gabe said, snapping his finger. "I keep forgetting that." AJ folded his arms at his chest uncomfortably, knowing how this looked, and knowing that any second, Melody was going to walk up furious. Or worse, Blaine would walk up and knock him through the funhouse mirror next to the awning. "Oh, bad news, AJ," Ashley said, shaking her head. "What's that?" "Melody got sick." "Sick?" AJ asked with instant concern, and he felt Eve's hand fall from his waist. "What happened? Where is she?" "Blaine took her home," Lisa said, looking right at Eve. "She was in pretty bad shape." "Blaine? But—" "We told them we could take Eve home," Lisa continued. "Blaine said to tell you he was sorry, Eve." "Oh," Eve said, obviously trying to sound thankful and properly crushed by the news, but no one standing there believed either. She looked at AJ uncertainly. "Maybe we should call them, make sure they got home all right." Gabe looked at his watch. "It'll be at least another hour before they get home. What do you say we head back and grab something to eat between here and there?" "Now?" Ashley said in surprise. "The park's not even closed yet." "Yeah, but my shoes are all squishy. That's annoying," Gabe said, lifting one and then the other up to demonstrate. "Oh, heavens, he has squishy shoes," Ashley said to the others dramatically. "We can't have that." "Well, if someone would pay me what he owes me, I might be able to afford new shoes," Gabe said as they turned for the gate. Jeff shook his head. "Then I guess you're just going to have to squish forever." The other two couples strode in front of them as Eve walked carefully at AJ's side, her arms crossed so as not to touch him. "I hope Melody's okay," she finally said so that the others couldn't hear her. He smiled at the note of genuine concern in her voice. "I'm sure she is. Mel always does more stuff than she should." They walked in lockstep for a minute. "I'm sorry Blaine left." Then Eve looked at AJ and smiled. "I'm not." The tissue-thin barrier between them ripped in half as he reached over and collared her around the neck. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you planned this." "I'm thinking somebody did," she said, gazing at him peacefully as she wrapped her arms around his waist. "But it wasn't me." His heart carried his lips to her head, and she giggled. "Got any ideas who I should be thanking, then?" he asked. She arched her neck over his arm and looked up into the now light gray sky above them. "Somebody who understands a whole lot more about life than I ever will." And her clutch on him tightened. "I hear you there," he breathed softly as he kissed her hair again. "I hear you there." "They said you should come," AJ said to Melody 5 days before the July 4th holiday. "Water skiing, fireworks, and your very best friend in the whole world, all in one place. What more could you ask for?" "My very best friend, huh? This wouldn't be the same friend who asked me out on a date, then got engaged to someone else while we were there, would it?" "Okay, technically you were gone before we got back together, and secondly, we didn't get engaged." "Close enough. I mean, it's not like I've seen you since." "Okay, so there's another good reason to come, so you can see me." "Oh, yeah, that's a real incentive. Besides, I don't even know these people. They're your friends, not mine, remember? Not to even mention the fact that I'd be there by myself. So basically, I'm thinking no." "But if you come, you'll get to know them, and then they can be your friends, and we can all be friends together." "Well, as Brady Bunch as that sounds, I think you're going to have to do this one without me. Besides, you'll have Little Miss Perfect there to keep you company anyway. I'm sure you won't even miss me." "You know, Mel, Eve really is a nice person, and I'd really like it if you could at least try to be civil to her." "I am civil, from way over here." AJ sighed. "Okay, look, it's highly possible that I'm going to want you in my wedding." "I thought you weren't engaged." "But for that to happen, I think it would be nice if you at least knew the person I'd be marrying." Melody went quiet for the first time since hello, and AJ scratched his head, waiting for her answer and trying to think of another argument if she said no. "Can I bring a date?" she finally asked, and he stumbled on the question. "A date? Well, sure, I guess, if you want to." "Then I'll be there." "Wow, Eve, nice suit," Ashley said when Eve and AJ walked up the steps to the lake house, where Gabe, Ashley, and Jeff were already lounging. "Thanks," Eve said, looking down at the all-black mallet that hadn't seen water in 2 years. "And what about my ensemble?" AJ asked, turning to model the oversized knee-length shorts that were 6 clashing hues of turquoise, blue, green, and orange, topped off with a blindingly white shirt. "It looks like a garage sale reject," Gabe said. "Saved me $25 going to that garage sale," AJ said. "What'd they cost? Like $1?" 50 cents, AJ said proudly. "You paid too much," Jeff said, shaking his head. "Hey, AJ, is Melody coming?" Ashley asked. He shrugged. She said she was. "And she's bringing a date," Eve said with a lift of her eyebrows. "Go Melody," Gabe said. "So are we eating first or skiing first?" Jeff asked. "I vote skiing," AJ said, and they all looked at him incredulously. "What?" "Okay, Eve," Ashley said as she narrowed her gaze at him. "Who is this, and what did you do with AJ?" Eve just laughed as she huddled into the circle of his arm. He was AJ, her AJ, the man she had prayed for only in her deepest dreams. "Ugh, don't mind them," Gabe said with a roll of his eyes. "They're in love." "Who's in love?" Lisa asked as she walked out of the house with Alex, resplendent in his tiny backward cap. "Oh, look at you!" Eve squealed as she peeled Alex from his mother's arms. "If you aren't the cutest!" "See, AJ," Gabe said. "Look how fast you got replaced." Eve looked back at AJ and smiled. "You're cute, too." And he bent and kissed her. "Blech," Gabe said, standing back. "Let's get this boat in the water before I get sick." "Hey, wait for us. We're here," someone called from the side of the house. And in the next second, Blaine pulled Melody through the bushes, bounced onto the deck, and pulled her up with him. Instantly, The whole party went silent. Gabe was the first to recover. "Blaine, Melody, you made it. Cool." "Let the festivities begin," Blaine said joyfully. "I didn't know she was bringing him," Eve whispered to AJ when the others were getting into the boat. "Do I look like I knew?" he asked, and she could tell he was as thrilled as she was about the turn of events. Then he sighed and looked at her. "Don't let them ruin this, okay? I mean, you are water skiing today, right?" She wrinkled her face. "I was hoping you didn't remember that part." "Here." He held her hand as she stepped in. "You going to get that?" Gabe asked as he started the boat. "Got it," AJ answered, even as Eve took the one seat left, right next to Melody, in the back. She tried to smile at her seatmate but received only ice in return. What she wouldn't give at that moment for a bigger boat. Quickly, AJ untied first one rope, then the next, then the final as Gabe began idling the boat backward into the water. She watched AJ take hold of the side of the boat even as she tried to figure out how he was planning on getting in. Down the dock he pushed the boat, and she couldn't help but think she was glad he'd left the white shirt on the dock. That tan, that chest, those muscles. It was all she could do to keep her mind on the fact that it wasn't just the two of them out here together. Lucky for him, she thought, and then buried that thought and its subsequent smile in her shoulder. At the end of the dock, in one fluid motion, AJ pushed the boat one final time, made a leap into the boat, and landed right in front of her. "Hey there," he said with a wink, when his hands caught the sides of her seat to stop himself. "Hey," she said, gazing into his soft golden eyes. In a blink, he leaned down and kissed her, and once again, she wished they were alone. "Hey, Knight," Gabe called from the front. "Get in your seat or you're going to have to climb up there going 60. With one more wink, he left her and stepped past the captain's chairs that held Jeff and Gabe up front. The further he went from her, the less she liked this seating arrangement, until all the way at the front of the boat, he finally sat on the perch and turned back so he could watch them rather than where they were going. "Ready?" Gabe asked, revving the engine. "You know it," AJ said, and his smile slid across her heart like the rays of warm sunshine streaming down on them. The lake house had disappeared long before. Out in the lake, Gabe slowed to an idle and shut the boat off. "Okay," he said. "Who's first?" For one split second, no one volunteered. "I guess that would be me," Jeff said with a sigh. "You need help?" AJ asked. "No, I've got it." "Suit yourself." AJ grabbed the orange flag Gabe handed him. He put it in the air and watched Jeff jump into the water. In quick succession, Gabe hooked the ski rope up and swung it like a lasso over his head. "You ready?" Gabe called to Jeff, who waved. The rope sailed out to Jeff, who grabbed it. Quickly, Gabe pulled the skis out of the back seat and slid them to Jeff. A small fight ensued in the water as Jeff tried to simultaneously keep track of the rope, both skis, and his feet. "You sure you don't need help?" AJ called, fighting not to laugh. "Hey, no heckling from the balcony," Jeff yelled back as he finally got all three pieces of equipment in place. "Just asking," AJ said with a shrug. Gabe came back to the front and started the motor as Jeff struggled to get into position. "Get the rope on the other side of your ski," AJ called, realizing it was twisted. Jeff wrestled with it and then held up a thumb. "You ready?" Gabe yelled, looking back over his shoulder. One more moment, and Jeff went still. "Hit it!" Like a bronco, they were off. AJ watched his friend as his body went taut with the force. Then slowly, he pulled himself up. In seconds, he was sliding to one side and then the other across the water. It looked like freedom itself, and AJ couldn't wait to get out there. When his gaze fell to Eve, she looked at him in barely disguised panic, and he smiled and winked. She was going to love this as much as he did. She just didn't know it yet. "Who's next?" Gabe asked when Jeff gave up, and Eve's stomach nodded. Gabe looked around at the three on the back seat. "Eve?" Her chest hurt so badly she couldn't get the no to come out. It was then that she saw AJ slide from his perch back down into the boat. "Come on," he said, pulling her to her feet. "I'll help." Although it should have, that assurance didn't make her feel much better. Nonetheless, she stood and slipped out of her shorts. They stepped to the side of the boat. "Don't try to be Grace here," AJ said. "Just jump in." Berating herself for getting this close to the reality of doing this in the first place, Eve dropped her legs over the edge, covered her nose, and then fell into the water. By the time she came up, AJ was paddling beside her. "I'd give that a 10. "Shut up." She shook her head, but the smile crossed her face despite wanting to slug him. Together they swam out to where Jeff was. "Nice moves," AJ said to Jeff as they transferred a ski. "I was just happy to stay standing," Jeff said. He handed the other ski to AJ and looked at Eve. The peace in his eyes transferred into her spirit. "Good luck out there." "Thanks," she said softly. With that, he swam away. "Okay," AJ said, swinging into instructor mode. "Skis first." He wound the skis around so they were pointing toward the boat. "You're going to have to pull one of your feet up here." Fighting not to float away from him, Eve pulled one foot up, and together they got the first ski on. It flopped out awkwardly to one side as the water lapped up in her face. "Next one." She repeated the process, wondering why she had ever so much as mentioned doing this. However, before she had a chance to tell him that, he turned back to the boat. "We need the rope." Gabe started the boat, and slowly it circled them until AJ reached out like stabbing a fish and grabbed the line. When he turned back to her, Eve's "I don't want to do this anymore" mechanism kicked into gear. "I think this was a bad idea," she said, shaking her head. He smiled. "Mount Everest, here we come." He handed her the rope. "Okay, you have to sit in the water. Pull your skis up in front of you." "They are in front of me." "No, up, out of the water like this." He set his hand at an incline to the water. She tried to do what he was telling her. "They're heavy," she said, thinking that her feet looked like a giant T in the water ahead of her. Fighting the water splashing up and over her face, not to mention the pull of the skis, she yanked one up and almost got it in place just as it fell the opposite direction and splashed back into the water. Frustration took over. "Ah!" "It's not easy," AJ said, "but you can do it. You just have to get both of them up at the same time." "Oh, yeah, no problem." Pulling until her body felt like it might crack down the middle, she fought the thought that she was going to drown before she got everything into position. The water seemed to be coming from all directions at once. "This isn't working." "You've almost got it. Think pointing your feet to the sky." Finally, with one massive effort, she managed to get both skis in the air. The water around her pushed her up on its energy and then let her fall, which could have put her to sleep had she been in any other situation. "And the rope goes between them," AJ said, tossing it over the top of one ski. He waved to Gabe, and the boat roared to life. Even the rocking of the waves slipped from her mind as fear took over. "Good," AJ coached. "Now, when you say go, they're going to go, and you've got to hold on tight." Slowly, he backed away from her and smiled. "Whenever you're ready." She exhaled slowly, looked at the boat, and yanked courage to her. "Go!" The boat ahead jumped forward, and the rope in her hands yanked taut. Her hands, which she had thought were ready, jerked forward, releasing the rope, and once again she was in the water, only this time face down. She fought the skis and the current to get turned back over. Spluttering water, she resurfaced. "Not bad," AJ said, swimming up to her. She would have hated to see bad. "Okay, this time when it pulls, use your whole body to hold on, not just your arms. And pull with your leg muscles when it feels like you can stand." Stand? How about not crash? But Eve just nodded, wishing she could quit, but knowing he wouldn't let her do that after only one miserable attempt. The boat circled, and AJ grabbed the rope. The fight with her skis hadn't gotten any easier, but after 2 attempts that made her look like an unruly windmill, she got them in place. "Ready?" AJ asked, and she nodded. He waved to Gabe and swam away from her. She forced herself to concentrate as she looked at the boat. Go! The yank of the boat jerked the rope, but she held on with determination. It wasn't called skiing exactly, as for a few seconds she didn't even leave the water. Then, miraculously, the water let go of her. "Stand! Stand!" AJ yelled from somewhere far away from her, and she fought to get herself upright. However, at the apex of the stand, her skis decided to split her legs in two, and the rope escaped from her consciousness. 2 seconds later, she was once again face down in the water. When she found the surface, she hit the waves with one hand angrily. "Better," AJ said as he swam up to her side. He looked like part of the waves just bobbing up and down with them as he retrieved the ski she hadn't realized had come off. Carefully, he positioned it next to her. "This time, when you get up, don't lean so far forward." "I think my face is going to have water burns," she said. He laughed. "I've never seen a water burn. What would you treat something like that with?" "Well, boyfriend strangulation is the preferred method." His smile never left. "Oh, good thing we brought Blaine then." "Blaine wasn't who I had in mind," she said as her hand worked to get the ski back on. "Oh, he wasn't?" AJ asked innocently. Then who did you have in mind?" "I think you know him." The ski slipped onto her foot and she smirked at him. "He's the guy who's going to kiss me for good luck." The boat was circling as gently he reached out to her, and his lips met hers. Then he pulled back and gazed at her. "Then I guess I'm the lucky one, huh?" Her soul sparkled right through her eyes. "I guess so." A moment, and then he snapped back to his job, barely grabbing the ski rope before it slid past them. When he swam back to her with it in his grasp, he was all business. "When you get up, think about leaning backward, not forward. Forward and you'll crash. Oh, and keep your skis together. Don't let them separate." She nodded at his instructions as she got herself back in the water. "Don't fight it, just let your body do it," he said as he handed her the rope and surveyed her positioning. Everything was set, and he leaned into her. One quick kiss, and he backed away with a wave to Gabe. "Good luck." When he was gone, Eve sighed the smile away from her heart and refocused on her preparations. The moment that everything felt set, she looked up at the boat. "Hit it!" The boat slid forward, the rope slid forward, and suddenly she too was going forward. A moment, and another, and her feet came underneath her as she pulled up out of the water. "Stand! Stand!" AJ called, and her body slipped into a semi-standing position. "Yeah!" His instructions ran through her. "Don't lean forward. Keep your skis together. Let your body do the work." Slowly, in a wide arc, she slid across the waves behind the boat. However, there was too much thinking involved to call it fun or free. 3/4 of the way around, she felt one leg losing the battle to keep the skis in line, and, with little other thought, she let go of the rope and toppled into the water. When she came up, all she could really feel was tired. She paddled until AJ made it back to her. "Yeah," he said, clapping his hands above his head. "You did it! Good job!" "I did?" she asked, not totally sure this wasn't a dream. "You did! Good job!" he said as the boat came back around. "Ready to go again?" Slowly, she shook her head. "I think I need a break." "Okay." He waved Gabe closer. "She's getting out." Gabe nodded, and AJ set to work getting her out of the skis. "You next," Gabe yelled to AJ. "Guess so," he yelled back. "You need some help?" Eve asked, and just before he said no, he caught sight of her teasing smile. "Well, a kiss wouldn't hurt," he said, returning the smile. As the waves bounced her up, her lips found his, and she laughed when she backed away. "Don't hit anything." He laughed. "I'll try not to." She turned and swam back to the boat where Jeff bent to help her in. "Looking good," he said as she half-stepped, half-fell into the boat. That's harder than it looks." "Tell me about it," he said as she started for her previous seat. "Oh, here, why don't you take this one? It's more comfortable." Grateful that she wouldn't have to sit in the back with Blaine and Melody, Eve slipped into the captain's chair next to Gabe. "Amazing. I'm still in one piece." Gabe looked at her and laughed. Of course, you were in good hands. The best, she thought as she spun in her seat to watch AJ get ready for his run. AJ watched her swim back to the boat. Half of his attention was on her and making sure she got in all right, and half of it was on getting the skis secured on his own feet. Seeing her ski had done nothing but make him more excited about the prospect of riding the waves himself. Once the skis were on his feet, he waved to Gabe, who started the boat and circled it around. With a lunge, AJ snagged the rope. He repositioned himself in the water. Then, checking each aspect of himself to make sure all systems were go, he got his skis into position. When he was ready, he glanced forward, and all he saw was her beautiful face. This would surely be a day to remember. Hit it! Moments later, his heart wasn't all that was flying. His skis slipped easily over the glass of water in the wake of the boat. It had been years, and yet it felt like only minutes since he'd done this. With little trouble, he pulled the rope in to his stomach and leaned back on the skis as the day slid around him in a perfect arc. When the boat began its first turn, he took full advantage of it and bounced over the wave until he was right next to the boat. He waved at Eve, and joy was written all over her face when she waved back. Yes, this was perfect. More perfect than he could have asked for. Then, as he slid back behind the boat, his gaze snagged on Blaine and Melody. Okay, perfect with them around didn't shine quite as brightly, but he pushed that thought away as he leaped up over the wave on the opposite side of the boat. He wasn't going to think about them or anything other than the things that he wanted so much to remember about this day, like Eve and her kiss and her hands. When he came back around, mischief caught his heart. Carefully, he began working one foot out of his ski. Thankfully, there were no ramps to run into around here, but it had been a while since he'd tried this trick. His foot was nearly out when he picked that ski out of the water and kicked it off. The effect worked like magic as simultaneously he watched the members of the little expedition jump in surprise. Easily, he slipped his foot into the foothold at the back of the other ski and waved to them. Jeff shook his head with reluctant admiration, and even Eve eventually smiled. As he ramped over the next wave and then back over it, forcing the air under his ski, flying wasn't that far away. He pulled up behind the boat, got his balance, and then leaped out of the water, spinning and catching the rope so that he was skiing not forward but backward. It was interesting seeing not where they were going, but where they had been. That understanding slid through him as his heart retraced their steps to this point. After another minute, the decision to leave the past in the past traced through him. It was time to look forward, and with that, he made one final leap and found himself looking into the only future he ever wanted to see. Happiness flooded his soul as her smile found his consciousness. Make the decision, something in him said, and the courage will follow. The decision had been made, and he could feel the courage with no question. She was his future, and he was hers. They were together, and that was the only way he ever wanted to face any future he had. "Are you all going out again later?" Ashley asked as they sat in the various lawn chairs scattered across the deck, devouring the hamburgers Ashley and Lisa had made while they were gone. "I'm not. I'll get more lobster eyes than I already am," Melody said, arching her gaze so she could look at her shoulder that had already taken on a bright red hue. "Besides, I don't know how much more of that up and down wave stuff I can take." "Oh, no," Blaine said seriously from the lawn chair he occupied next to her. "Then you're definitely not going out again. We really don't want a repeat of my car after Astroworld." AJ's gaze went to the cocky face hidden behind a dark pair of sunglasses across from him. Why Melody had asked Blaine, AJ didn't even want to think about. She was too good for that jerk, and it didn't take getting to know him to know that. The designer swim trunks, the expensive sunglasses, the jet black hair, all choreographed to tell the world, "Look how wonderful I am." Melody didn't need the boat to make her sick. Her date should have done a good enough job of that. However, when Melody glanced at Blaine like he'd just fallen there from heaven, AJ wanted to do nothing more than dump him and the lawn chair into the shimmering water beyond. "What are you complaining about?" Melody said with a shrug. "You got your car cleaned. Besides, you wouldn't be here today if I hadn't gotten sick that day." "This is true," Blaine said, bobbing his head with a smirk, and AJ wished he could knock that head right off those shoulders. Then Blaine looked back at the group, clearly enjoying the attention. "So, Melody's in. Who else is going?" "I am not," she said, smacking his shoulder. "Geez, if the water didn't make me sick, all that hot dogging out there sure did." She pinned AJ with a skewering gaze before he had a chance to disengage his gaze from them. "What hot dogging?" he asked innocently. With a rip, he focused on the true reason he was here. "I was just trying to keep up with Eve." The grape soda Eve was drinking spewed from her mouth, and she quickly wiped it away. "Oh, yeah, I'm so sure you were worried about keeping up with me." "I was. You're such a natural." "You skied?" Lisa asked. "I tried," Eve said in annoyance, "but I don't think I'd exactly call it skiing." "Oh, this I've got to see," Lisa said. "Count me in." Ashley laid her hand on Gabe's thigh. "So, did you get to go out?" Gabe pointed to himself. "Driver." "I can drive if you want," AJ said with a shrug. "That way you could catch some waves." "Oh boy, that sounds scary," Gabe said. "I promise I won't run you into anything." "Yeah, but the question is, will you run the boat into anything?" AJ shook his head. "If the hospital trusts me with the ambulance, I think you can trust me with one little boat." Gabe didn't say anything for a moment, and then he looked at his wife. "Ash?" She looked at AJ and smiled. "Have fun." "You need help?" AJ asked as Eve prepared to take over the skier's position from Jeff. Her eyebrows arched. A kiss wouldn't hurt. "No problem there," he said, pulling her, life jacket and all, to him. There was something about holding her while the boat pitched and settled. It felt like rocking on life itself, and the last thing he wanted to do was let her go. "Hey, you two, cut it out. I'm drowning out here," Jeff yelled. AJ laughed as he pulled back from her and winked. "Good luck." "Try to keep up." Jeff stayed to help Eve as she got her equipment on. In the boat, Lisa put her hands over her head and clapped. "Go, Eve!" Go, Eve, she thought with a shiver of pressure. This would be quite a spectacle. "Got it?" Jeff asked, putting a hand on her back to steady her in the waves. "Think so," she said, nodding. When he didn't move, she looked at him. "I think so too," he said softly. "Have fun." She wanted to say, "I will," but he was gone before she got those words out. Once he was in the boat and had taken his place beside Lisa, she smiled at the symmetry of life. Yeah, she had it, and this time she was going to appreciate it. "Hit it!" When Gabe took over for Eve on the waves later, AJ did his best to steer the boat sanely, even though he was constantly looking back at his friend's antics. Gabe was anything but smooth. However, AJ wondered as he watched the seemingly out-of-control performance how much of it was just that, a performance. As inept as Gabe looked out on the water, no one could be that bad and stay in control. He laughed with his friends when Gabe nearly lost the rope in the middle of an attempted hand change. When Gabe ran his free hand across his forehead in relief, AJ looked at Eve and shook his head. "What a ham." "How did you ever guess?" she asked. And with a smile, he laid one hand over hers as they skimmed across the lake, pulling Lou Costello's younger model behind them. Although Eve could tell he was trying, Blaine couldn't come close to AJ's sheer natural ability. In a way, she felt sorry for Blaine, and she felt somewhat responsible for that. He really was a nice guy. He'd just gotten thrown into a bad situation. She waved back at him as he crossed to the side of the boat. "Don't encourage him," AJ said in her ear. She looked back at him. "Blaine's okay if you give him a chance." But AJ looked less than convinced, so she arched her neck up to be able to catch his lips. "Besides, don't let him ruin this." As his arms wrapped around her, Eve knew she would never remember Blaine's presence this day. only AJ's. He was all she ever wanted to remember again. The boat rocked in the shallow waves long after they had come back out to it. The stars dotted the sky above them. Blaine and Melody had gone home shortly after they had redocked, something about Blaine having a headache. Having one or being one, AJ had wondered, but as the evening wore on without them, even they had slid from his consciousness. He didn't want to think about them or about anything else. He was here with Eve, and his one and only goal was to make the rest of the evening one she would never forget. As they sat in the back of the boat, his arm steadied her, and she snuggled closer to him. "Oh, wow, a blue one," Eve breathed, watching the sky beyond as it was lit with multicolored sparkles of crackling fire. An explosion blasted above them, and the sky lit into ivory. "Oh, wow, beautiful." AJ couldn't disagree. She was, inside and out. "Have you ever seen them like this?" "Never," she said, and his heart tripped over the peacefulness in her voice. Her body relaxed as her fingers curled around his. The fireworks continued above them as she watched. "I had fun today." He hugged her tighter. "So did I." "Yeah," she smiled up at him. "I could tell." "I love water skiing." Serenity dropped through her eyes when she gazed up at him. "I love you." Gently, he leaned to the side and planted a kiss on her head. "Yeah, seems like I remember that part." "And don't you ever forget it," she said, arching her face so that she could connect with his lips. "You never know," he said when they parted. "I just might forget. You'd better remind me again." She laughed. "We wouldn't want that." The feel of holding her as the waves lapped up, rocking the boat gently beneath them, lulled him away from reality. Seriousness seeped through him when she pulled away. "You shouldn't do this to me." "What?" she asked. "This," he said as the fireworks finale punctuated the rhythm of the rocking of his love when he pulled her back to him. Jeff and Lisa had taken Alex home. Not long after, Gabe and Ashley had called it a night. But before they left, they had told them they could have the deck to themselves for as long as they wanted it. Snuggling with AJ on the same lawn chair, Eve thought that they had no idea how long that could actually be. The white shirt had found its way back onto his body, but that was even all right because he hadn't bothered to button it, so instead of hiding anything, it did an extraordinary job of teasing her just to the point of insanity. Softly, she ran a hand under it and across the smooth skin of his chest. If anything could feel more perfect, she didn't know how. He moaned quietly. "You feel so good." She closed her eyes and huddled closer to him, swinging one sheer covered leg over his. "Not half as good as you feel." For a moment, they simply sat like that, holding each other and letting forever take care of itself. His hands sliding up and down her bare arms sent shivers of excitement across the same paths that they had just put to sleep. Peace had never felt so incredibly exhilarating. Then his hand slowed to a near halt. A moment, and then two. "Dance with me," he breathed, and she looked up at him in confusion. "Dance? But there isn't any music." His eyes smiled. "Sure there is." Carefully, he slid from under her and stood. His hand came down for hers, and when she stood, happiness flooded through her. The sheer black two-piece swimsuit cover-up gracing her body from shoulders to ankles blew gently in the breeze coming from the lake, and she brushed the tendrils of hair out of her face. Slowly, he led her out to the edge of the dock, where the small light on the lake house had ceded its hold on the darkness, lit only by the shimmering lights surrounding the water. And then there was only the two of them and the gently rocking waves below. He moved to her and slid his hands around her waist as she wrapped her wrists at his neck. "What, no jitterbug?" she asked with a grin. "Maybe later," he said, and the seriousness of his soft face pulled her heart to him. Her temple found his shoulder as her arms wrapped down his back. The world itself floated away as their bodies moved in time to the soft lap of the waves. Water skiing would never eclipse dancing with him on these waves, she thought, releasing everything in life other than him. A.J. Knight, the man of her dreams, her own personal white knight. She would cling to him with her very last breath if need be, and even then, he would be with her forever. You know, I've heard about people being in love ever since I was a little kid, he said softly, even as the pressure of his hand continued to move her side to side. And I wanted to believe it, to believe in it. But love was never anything but an illusion to me, until I met you. She was listening, and not just with her ears. His body was telling her as much as his words were. I know in this life there are no guarantees, he said, but I think you should know I've decided to make an exception to that rule. Oh yeah? What's that? She asked with the softest hint of a laugh. This, he said, and his movement stopped. When she pulled back from him, the tiny heart stone shone at her from its perch between his finger and thumb, and all teasing in her vanished. Oh, AJ, it's beautiful. She looked into his eyes, trying to surmise if it meant what she hoped it did. He smiled slightly as his gaze dropped. Carefully, he took her hand. I, AJ Knight, guarantee from this moment on that I'll be there for every single right now God grants me with you on this earth. He slid the ring onto her shaking finger as her tears blurred even his face. I guarantee that I'll protect you and that I'll love you every single moment of every single day. He gazed into her eyes with no hesitation whatsoever. And I guarantee that I'll be honest with you and faithful to you until God himself calls me home. Nowhere in her body, heart, or soul was there even a shred of doubt of those words. So much so that it seemed only right that she make her own pledge, although she hadn't even thought about what she would say until that very moment. When you came into my life, I thought that I'd lost love forever, that I would never have it in my life again. What I didn't know is that not only would I find it with you, but that with you, I'd find life again, too. When I wanted to quit, you wouldn't let me. And when I wanted to cry, you let me. And then you showed me how to laugh again. I don't know how I got so lucky or why God decided to bless me with you, but I'll tell you right now, I'm sure glad he did. His eyes were shining when her words wound to a stop. So does that mean the answer's yes? He asked. Well, I guess that depends on what the question is, doesn't it? The question, he said slowly as he bent to one knee, is, Eve, I love you. Will you marry me? She gazed into his eyes, and suddenly her happiness turned to mischief as she looked down at the sparkling heart now on her hand. Yes or no? Yes or no? She said, turning her hand back and forth. Then she stopped, looked him in the eye, and nodded solemnly. Yes, AJ, yes, of course I'll marry you. For one instant, he knelt there. Then, slowly, he stood. His arms slipped around her, and when he pulled her close, she closed her eyes, clutching that moment into her soul as together they danced on the water perfectly in time with the rhythm of God's plan. Epilogue. You know, a party's just not a party without you, AJ said, sliding up behind Eve as she stood on Jeff and Lisa's back porch, listening to the New Year's revelers celebrate inside. He looked down at the drink in her hand that she hadn't so much as sipped. See, I told you we should have brought something decent. She looked down at the drink and then turned slightly to look at him. Have you ever been so happy that you're afraid it can't last? What kind of question is that? He asked, lowering his eyebrows with concern. It's just, Lisa told me they're expecting again. Again? AJ backed up in astonishment. Wow, they don't waste any time, do they? And Gabe and Ashley seem so happy. And you and I are great." "Thank you so much," he said smugly. She reached up and hit him softly. "No, it's just that I look around and wonder how much longer it can all last. I mean, how long before everything changes again?" The laughter fell from his face as he wrapped his arms around her. "You know change isn't always bad. If it was, I wouldn't have stood up there and took those vows." But she didn't laugh at his joke. Gently, he turned her around and took her in his arms. "You know, sometimes when life turns a page, it can actually be for the better." Liking the warmth of him, she snuggled closer. "Like you and me?" "Yeah, like you and me." He held her there for a moment. "Think about it. To get to this page, we had to read all the other ones, but that doesn't mean the next one won't be just as good. Or better." His lips brushed across her hair. "Just think, what if you'd have been afraid of getting here last year?" "I was," she said softly. "And look how great it turned out," he said. "Man, I wouldn't have missed this for the world." The thoughts ran through her, and then she looked up at him. "It might be better." He smiled. "You never know." With that, he pulled her to him, and her soul wrapped around that idea. After another beat, he kissed the top of her head. "Now, what do you say we go back in there, throw some confetti in the air, and then go home?" "Home? But it's early," she said with some doubt about his sanity. "You never leave a party early." "Well, maybe we can go make our own little party and give Lisa and Jeff a run for their money." She laughed softly at that. "They're already one ahead of us." "Well, then we'd better get cracking, woman." She shook her head and laughed again. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were trying to seduce me." He kissed her gently as she swayed in his arms. "If I didn't know better, I'd think I already had." "You've got a point there." Despite the smile, she kissed him back. Nodding and smiling for all the stars to see, AJ lowered his lips to hers. "Just trying to keep up." "Is that a challenge?" she asked, looking into the soul of the man she wanted by her side now and always as he backed up enough to gaze at her. "It's whatever you want it to be." "Okay, then let's go throw some confetti already." She grabbed her drink from the railing and tossed it out onto the lawn. Then, arm in arm, they stepped back into the light of the house as fate lifted and then turned the page. This has been White Knight, Book 2, The Courage series, written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.
You don't want to miss what comes next. Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.